Hi, this is Pizza Wolf.
And I'm Tender Loving Cares, and you're listening to the Fat History Channel.
Actually, you're listening to the third episode of the Horngry for More podcast.
The podcast about fetishism by the community and for the community.
I'm hungry. I'm so hungry. Yeah. 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 I'm hungry.
Before we get started, TLC and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy that happened at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. As you may remember, I'm from Florida. I went to college in Orlando. I've been to Pulse nightclub and have many friends in the Orlando LGBT.
So welcome back to the third episode, and first of all I wanted to say huge thanks to all the members who gave us a lot of feedback on the second episode. Many of you absolutely loved the origin stories, and
We did too.
yes, we did, we definitely did. That was heartwarming and emotional, and it was amazing. I really loved it. So thank
Out.
Yep.
And, you know, just a reminder to our audience, we love feedback, and we love substantive feedback, too. So if you can tell us specifically what you liked and what you didn't like, what worked.
Be like whatever way. As long as we read it, we're gonna try and fit it into the
Podcast, so we're kind of learning as we go.
Yep. Oh, by the way, which reminds me of our first episode when it was
wow,
awesome
great.
suddenly seeing it on kind of a mainstream article. They didn't go into the Fat Pride
Mhm.
as runner-ups. Basically, they also had the Fat Pride flag in there and the letter Pride flag, and it was. So as you might have seen from or heard, as you might have heard from our little intro teaser, you can kind of guess where this episode is going, and we're gonna be looking at the history of fetishism and fat admiration throughout the last centuries, for as far back as we can kind of look into, and we're just gonna make a quick rundown
Of a century. I thought it might only be a decade or two old, and it was really great for us throughout history, because we really found a lot.
We found a bunch of stuff. Now, before we go, fun and a cute thing also for people to look up for themselves. So, my palate cleanser for this month is gonna be fetishism scenes in live-action TV or movies. So, my number 3 is from the 1963 movie Tom Jones. It's the main that you can all look up on YouTube, where they're devouring like a multiple-course meal, and the camera in almost complete silence keeps panning from Tom to Jenny, back and forth again as they like keep eating like one course after the other. No silverware, all hands. It's like a really raw and amazingly kind of sexy, gluttonous scene, because they keep amping up the sexual tension as they kind of try to seduce each other while eating, and they're eating everything, like from lobsters, they're slurping oysters, they're eating turkey legs,
Oh,
and
wow.
the bedroom, so everyone knows where this is going. It's amazing to see like food connected
Great,
to sex,
yeah.
so I love that scene.
Sure.
My number 2 should be more famous for a lot of people, even though I haven't seen the movie, but I've definitely seen the scene and seen the spoof of it in Hot Shots. But it's from the movie 9.5 Weeks, and it's Kim Basinger kind of seduces her taste buds. He's feeding her olives, cherry tomatoes, strawberries, and jalapenos, and she even chucks a huge glass of milk, which is what gets me always the most.
I wonder why.
Yeah. Until he almost kind of showers her with honey, which turns into this perfect make-out scene in front of the fridge, and yeah, that was a hot scene. I get it.
Making out in front of the fridge. I wonder who wrote that.
We are everywhere. My number 1 scene is from American Horror Story season 4.
Yeah. I think I'm familiar with the scene you're talking about, but no, I don't watch it.
It's episode 9, which is called Tupperware Party Massacre. So as a little warning, everything is set in this like 1950s, and a lot of those sideshows had fat people as part of their attraction. So it would kind of seem a little bit demeaning, but the whole show is filmed, and it's an amazing scene because it's Jimmy, played by Evan Peters, who's spoon feeding the new addition to. Yep.
Well, really only one way to take that.
Exactly, and it's an amazing. I absolutely love it. And later in the movie, there's even a sex scene between the two of them, where basically Jimmy's girlfriend walks into the two of them, and she starts insulting them. And
I mean, that's a weird thing to say. How nice it is to see a fat person objectified, but you know, it's few and far between. So sometimes it's at least it's indeed a palate cleanser. That was a really good list, TLC,
and it was already historical.
Yeah. Sure, it covered a very broad spectrum, but I think we're going to broaden it up even further as possible, and it's really, really far back to the first depiction contact with the Venus of Willendorf in describing a kind of a feminine ideal or something, and just like people come into the between 25,000, 28,000 years. And it's made out of limestone. It was found in the Willendorf Valley in what's now Germany. People of whom we have no record other than this figure. It's about 4.5 inches tall. Fertility goddess, or a goddess of the harvest or plenty. Probably infer is the people who made it didn't have a lot of spare time on their hands to just carve figures willy-nilly. So they probably made sure to represent things that were important to them.
Yeah.
And so this is the earliest depiction we can really find of the value of the fat form.
And we see similar depiction in a lot of other cultures as well. Like there's the famous temples of Malta, for example. There's a lot of those statues around. As you've said, we have no way of knowing what exactly the meaning was because we don't have anything but those statues. But you can kind of see them everywhere. And I know, for example, those temples in Malta that have the same like voluptuous female figures that we kind of assume are depictions of deities, maybe. That's also like from 2500 BC, for example. So they're out there, and it was pretty common for some reason. We just can't know what exactly the reason was, but as you said, probably some religious connotation is what most people are assuming.
And even in religions that persist to this day, there's been somewhat of an appropriation of kind of those earlier gods of plenty or contentment or jolliness. The one that springs to mind is the Budai from China. Although it's now regarded as a Buddha symbol, it's believed that it may have existed even before that. And you know, if you're familiar with the story of the historical Buddha, you'd know he was of Indian in heritage, and as far as we can tell, he was just a thin man or a man of average size. And then later, we see this depiction, from Chinese Buddhism of this big, fat, laughing Buddha with big earlobes, who's always kind of jolly and celebrating. And that's actually the Budai. His name translates from Chinese to either laughing Buddha or fat Buddha, and it came to represent contentment and happiness and jolliness, kind of in an almost spiritual sense, a spiritual contentment and joy through everything. So these may be kind of characteristics of size which just somehow instinctively talk to us, regardless of culture, regardless of anything else. We just tend to make that that fat and happy association.
and it kind of makes sense historically, because if you consider those times where people really struggled a lot to gather those resources they actually needed to put on weight, the association was basically made. The people who are fatter usually were those who were better off than the poorer people. Well, they literally didn't have to worry about where the next meal was coming from, which is basically what contentment is about. And once their association is there, that like, okay, bigger equals happier, even bigger might be even happier, and it's interesting. It's interesting to see that connection.
The converse was certainly true. It was very a very real possibility that we don't think of today. That if you were not fat, if you were the complete opposite of fat, there was a very real chance of you possibly suffering from food scarcity related diseases or even starving to death.
Yeah.
So indeed, yeah, being fat would at least tick off the starving to death box on things that are not going to kill you today. I think your point's very well taken. It's actually good that you mentioned kind of food resources, because kind of with the rise of media as a cross-cultural thing, or something that you saw more of, kind of came with it the rise of a more pervasive beauty standard, and we saw with it a beauty standard which was tied to the thing that was tough to get. And historically, when most people were peasants or farmers or agricultural laborers, they typically did not have a lot of food, and they worked outside. So being what we think of as attractive, conventionally attractive today, being tan and lean and, and muscular and sun-kissed, that's what the poor people looked like. And it wasn't considered historically beautiful. Historically beautiful people were pale and plump and, and showed no signs of having been shaped by toil or backbreaking labor.
Mm-hmm.
And we see those depictions in, as mentioned before, most popularly, famously, Peter Paul Rubens, but many of the Dutch masters, many of the Baroque and Renaissance artists portrayed similarly soft bodies, both male and female. And it's interesting to note, too, that just kind of a lot of the negative connotations we have about fat today in terms of being lazy or dim-witted or things like that just simply weren't around at that time. Famously, King Henry VIII of England, he was just a gigantic guy, taller and larger than most of his contemporaries. He'd be considered tall and large today. So you can only imagine, at a time when the average man was barely over 5 feet tall.
How tall was he?
I think he was 6'5".
Oh wow!
I think that's but
that's impressive.
Could also be the kind of the historical embellishment. Who knows?
Like telephone, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Telephone through the centuries, so it could get a little lost. But even in his later portraits, when he retired from the active life of a military king or a king who participated more in tourneys and things like that, and he put on a substantial amount of weight. We have portraits of Henry VIII as a fat man, and this is imposing a regal carriage, not necessarily he's oafish or clumsy or silly or lazy.
Yep.
He was portrayed as fat, but fat wasn't communicating the same things then
It was
that it sometimes
and
does now. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was imposing and dominant. Even it may have even enforced the aura of royal power as opposed to presence. Who knows? Maybe I'm going too far.
Well, maybe his size is like the only endearing quality we can now find about him.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't stop making jabs at him.
No. Oh, yeah. You lay off Henry VIII. No. He had more than his fair share of foibles, but that's another podcast.
Exactly.
But that kind of relationship between what we considered beautiful and what and people's body types persisted until kind of the rise of industrialized agriculture and greater access to cereal crops in the mid 1800s, so the middle of the 19th century, and that also kind of went hand in glove with our notion of health. We hadn't quite made it to germ theory. We hadn't quite made it to sterile surgical techniques, but people were kind of getting to the idea that there was more to health than just ill humors or bad vapors or these kind of outdated alchemical approaches to health. And one of kind of the natural ways to address things was diet-based medicine. And so there was a fad, most famously here in American Battle Creek, Michigan, with William and Joseph Kellogg, in their sanitarium, where they would put people on reducing diets, where they would eat nothing but one boiled potato a day, or cornflakes, most famously, and in an attempt to cure everything from diabetes to mental illness to the urge to masturbate, and kind of everything in between. It wasn't quite scientific, but it was an approach. It was kind of the start of an approach to weight management and diet culture, although interestingly it was always in response to a condition versus just trying to get someone to fit in a certain pair of pants. So a little bit different than what happened today.
Yeah, they actually tried to tackle the symptoms instead of just going for a beauty standard in that case.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's kind of been perverted since then into what would now be considered the diet industry, because it was also tying these medical diets, or as they referred, medical diets, as kind of loosely used back then, With good old American capitalism. So people were paying for it. And you're going to use the Kellogg system or the it's which might as well be called Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig or any of the popular diets today.
Yeah.
And we kind of saw an emergence then in that late 1800s period of social clubs that kind of emphasized weight as part of their raison d'etre, and you have a little bit more about those, right?
Yeah, I have an awesome little fun anecdote because I really went down the rabbit hole researching for this, and it was so much fun.
Mm-hmm.
So in the post-Civil War era, clubs were essential to businessmen when they were trying to build up like their contacts and their connections to actually make trades later on. And like a huge amount of clubs and associations sprung out from that, and they often tried to theme those clubs in order to attract like other businessmen to join. They just want to have like, this is going to be our recognizable thing. And there were stuff like the Anti-Bell Ringers Club, whatever that was.
Oh, well, you don't like ringing bells, clearly.
Apparently, yeah.
I had no idea.
And the Bald Man's Club, which kind of makes more sense. At least it's something you can, I can see he's bald.
Sure.
And then there were the Fat Man's Clubs, which, again, makes perfect sense. There's this fun little anecdote that I found from the New England Historical Society on Jerome Hale. He was like a tavern proprietor, a husky guy himself, and he was sitting with a few of his regulars around the fireplace one night, and his regulars were all like traveling businessmen. They were drinking, getting progressively more drunk probably, and bantering, and Hale just, like, one instance pointed out, look, we're probably all over 200 pounds. And he started making some jokes about that, and about that they have that in common, and that night the idea was born to form a club. And they decided in order to become a member of that club, you have to be at least 200 pounds. And they called it the New England's Fat Man Club. And that was in 1904, but there were many other such clubs. The earliest one I found was 1869. There were things like the Fat Men's Association of New York City, the Jolly Fat Men's Club, the United Association of Heavy Men of New York State.
Very, very formal.
Very formal, yeah. The Fat Men's Beneficial Association, the Heavyweights. Even in Paris, there was a club called Le Club de 100 Kilos, the club of 200 pounds, basically. Well, it's 220 pounds if you do the math, but it's along the very same lines. And they're exactly what they sound like. So yes, they were kind of built as kind of more of a business network, and surely that's what they bonded over during their working time. But the meetings they had sound exactly like ripped out of any weight gain fiction novel.
Wow.
Yes, so the New England Fat Man Club, for example, met twice a year during spring and fall, and the meetings usually started with a weigh-in. And the weigh-in was amazingly competitive, during which like the proudest man would be the one who weighed in as the fattest of them all. And
oh, wow.
Yes, those meetings were announced like well in advance so that members could all make sure that they'd be fat enough for the weigh-ins, and if not, they would actually get sent home, so...
Okay, so something was at stake here. It was serious.
It was very serious. It wasn't that serious, but it's still... They had this one rule, and at least that rule you gotta follow. And I know like 200 pounds doesn't sound like a lot. I found info in the old Boston Globe article that said like the fattest man was 377, and then the next year he was outweighed by a guy from Maine who weighed in at 439. So all sizes, but definitely above 200 pounds was fine. And we have to keep in mind it's 1904. It wasn't as common as it is today to be that big. So yeah, for that time it was awesome.
Sure, yeah.
After the weigh-ins, they had a bunch of fun. They did like a potato race, a tug of war, even sillier stuff. They had a high kick competition, and they played leapfrog. And all of this happened in the backyard of the tavern, so I guarantee they were probably all drunk and having fun. They tried pole vaulting, but they abandoned it because they couldn't find a pole sturdy enough.
Haha.
Yeah. And the baseball games, they were made up of teams that each weighed a ton. So... I really wanted to be there.
Poor thing.
I was born in the wrong time. So.
Maybe you were.
But of course, as you'd expect from any Fat Man's Club, all of this was followed up by a feast that kept going well into night, well past midnight, where they would eat and stuff themselves the whole night. They had huge fun doing so. They had orchestra. On one occasion, there was even a Fat Ladies Club who would sing along to the orchestra. Club members who had instruments would just join in, special guests were introduced, letters of regret from absent members were read aloud, which almost turned into kind of more of a stand-up comedy thing because each letter tried to outdo the last one. And even the feast was amazing. Like in the Boston Globe article I mentioned, they said one feast was made up of, started off with oyster cocktails, they had cream of chicken soup, boiled snapper, filet of beef with mushrooms, they had roast chicken, roast suckling pig, then they had shrimp salad, steamed fruit pudding with brandy sauce, cakes, cheese, and ice cream. And of course, as it would be with any gentleman's club, they had coffee and cigars at the end.
Ah, yes.
And the meeting usually ended with fireworks and the fire balloon, and like the whole town would gather to watch the fireworks at the end. And it was interesting because then again you could see how rare it was for some people to see that. And the Boston Globe article, for example, describes the whole meeting as follows. The natives, who are mostly bony and angular, have stared with envy at the portly forms and rubicund faces which have arrived on every train.
Envy.
Yeah.
Don't get a lot of that anymore, but
Nope.
how nice.
Nope. Yeah, it's almost a culture shock reading those things from back then. By 1911, they were meeting monthly, but with the uncertainty of the wars that followed and the Great Depression, they kind of eventually disbanded. I know the last meeting was held in 1925, and Hale's Tavern, for anyone who would have loved to visit it, who lives in New England, who lives close to that area, but unfortunately it got torn down in 1956 and eventually replaced by a gas station. So you can go feed your car there if you want to. That's like the most you're gonna get.
Oh, it's not the same.
It's not the same, no. And because I don't want to end this little historical anecdote on this kind of depressing thought of an old ugly gas station, I have this one last amazing thing that I found in that Golden Globe article, and it describes the toast they had. At the beginning of each banquet, they would raise their glasses and they would say the following. A toast to us, my good kind friends, to bless the things we eat, for it has been full many a year since we have seen our feet. But who would lose a precious pound by trading sweets for sours? It takes a mighty girth indeed to hold kind hearts as ours.
No, that's a ridiculously sweet toast.
Yes.
Should bring it back.
Yeah. It's heartwarming. And just as a last little info, the most famous member of that New England's Fat Man Club was actually 3 times Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan.
No, William Jennings Bryan, famous for his opposition to the gold standard. For those of you who are history buffs. While we're on the subject of famous fat men throughout American history, I'm going to go ahead and bring up our fattest president, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft is a remarkable character who presided over America during an interesting time. He had a whole bunch of jobs. He was the president. He was the Chief Justice of the United States, the only person before or since to be at the top position of 2 branches of American government. He was the Secretary of War. He was the Solicitor General. He was the governor of Cuba. He was the governor of the Philippines. He did
Wow.
many, 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 many things. However, we remember him for one thing and one thing only in most popular imagination, which is he was our fattest president, and one time he got stuck in the bathtub at the White House. And it's somewhat of a sad story because at his heaviest, when he was president, he was 340 pounds, according to his doctors. And he was desperate to lose this weight. He went on reducing diets, similar to the ones that Kellogg touted. Vegetables, no grains. He was basically low carb, gluten free, all that jazz. He lost weight, got down to about 255, but then gained it back. Which kind of speaks to the complicated relationship between biology and weight. And even when you're the most powerful man in the free world, diets still don't really work all the time. But Taft is an interesting character, and it's interesting to me to wonder if a fat man, certainly a 340-pound fat man, could ever run for national office today in the age and era of television.
Considering the fun they made out of Bill Clinton for being slightly, I mean, I wouldn't even consider him chubby, but they even then they made fun of him for eating at what was it, McDonald's or something like that.
Sure, yeah, and I mean he's a vegan now who's very slim.
Slim is a nice word for it.
Well, old guys who were fat and get skinny tend to kind of have that deflated balloon look, for lack of a better term. Sorry, old guys listening to our podcast.
He's also a very busy guy. He's a very busy guy.
He is a very busy guy. Even a political figure who I like substantially less, former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, who I doubt is 340 pounds. He has a lot to make fun of, but people still tend to take cheap shots at his weight as well, which is always a little frustrating. I'm not a particularly big fan of the man's politics, but if you don't like his actions as governor, you don't need to call him fat as a derogatory name. Whatever. That's neither here nor there. So let's keep this history train rolling and move ourselves onto the Roaring '20s, when America was flush with cash and it could never, ever, ever go wrong. Until, of course, it did. In the 20s, we saw kind of the rise of the Jazz Age, and then also, kind of different silhouettes for women's beauty standards than we'd seen previously. The flapper, kind of shorter haircuts, more androgynous body types were popular. And this kind of goes hand in glove with the idea that there was kind of an inverse relationship between economic prosperity and popular body types. So
by the way, as just a little tidbit that I've read about was that also during the 1920s there were the first established insurance companies that were opening up. They were kind of catching on to this whole health and diet thing, and so for a while there was some press out there kind of linking fat to health issues, and that definitely probably played a role in there for a second, until of course the whole world got turned upside down and we had other things to worry about.
Sure. But we had this idea that when we were doing well economically, thinner body types were popular, and when we were doing poorly, curvier body types came back in fashion. Maybe it was just kind of a retreat to that prehistoric idea of, well, fat people at least aren't going to starve to death. And I'm kind of making light of that. But, during the Dust Bowl in America, we had significant food shortages, and indeed, people did starve to death. Yeah. So it could happen. Who's to say? It's such a wide topic that it's hard to say if it's causal or not. But it certainly seems to be backed up by popular experience.
Also, when even today, when you look to older cultures that are still more impoverished than the more developed countries, where there's still a big difference in the beauty standards.
That's very true. One of the ones that I think we can take a brief detour and look at is Mauritania, which is in northwestern Africa. This is something that a lot of people who are into fetishism run across eventually, and it kind of looks like is ripped right from weight gain fiction, on its face, but it's kind of a much more insidious process. It's called Lebla. It's believed to have stemmed from a Tuareg tribal custom where girls really as young as 8 or 10 would be kind of sequestered from their family and fed a very high fat diet until they put on significant amounts of weight in preparation for finding them a husband. Interestingly enough, they were not allowed to choose whether they wanted to participate in this. They also didn't get to pick the husband. So this is kind of a system that's fraught with historical inequalities based on gender, but it also does speak to the existence of a beauty standard other than the current pervasive one, and kind of reminds us that none of this is empirical. This is all just culture, wherever it comes from, and the existence of beauty standards, be they fat, skinny, whatever, is kind of always a bad thing.
Yes. It shows this whole narrative that we kind of tend to nostalgically look back at the times where fatter used to be more acceptable, and those who are fat or admire fat people kind of almost sometimes I just had the same thing when I was talking about the Fat Men's Club, that I was kind of I wish I was back in that time, because it looked like all the kind of the fat shaming and stuff like that wouldn't have been there, but it's still a beauty standard that is kind of imposed on people if you want it or not. And it would be even us as I know that both of us definitely feel that way, that even though we'd love for fat bodies to be more represented, which definitely should happen, I personally wouldn't want it to be like the beauty standard. I would love for the beauty standard to be every beauty there is, like every form of body there is out there. And so even on cultures where fat was the beauty standard, which sounds amazing, like when you just read up on it in like your kinky state of mind, beauty standards just by themselves have a lot of downsides, no matter what body type it is.
Sure. The one thing that I wanted to mention to that effect was we actually see it in kind of what's left over in some of our language. On the periodic table of elements, there's the element antimony. You familiar with it? Big fan of no. So it's
I'm not a big fan of periodic tables.
Well, this is very popular etymology. It may or may not be true. But antimony is a highly toxic chemical, and one of the early stages of antimony poisoning is kind of a swelling and weight gain. And the idea that these itinerant monks would have antimony added to their food by their brother abbots, which would cause them to kind of look plump and rosy-cheeked and healthy, kind of a sign of God's grace. We thought it was a good thing until monks started dying by the bushel, and so antimony means monk killer, basically. Anti-mony.
Okay.
Well, literally in that, and there's been some discussion as to how legit that history is. But it goes to show that when no matter what the beauty standard is, people would kind of go towards dangerous lengths to achieve it, and frequently do things from what we see today with people who experience disordered eating, to what we've seen in the past, to these odd cultural institutions like Lubla that force people to conform to any sort of objective beauty standard rather than acknowledge the inherent beauty in everyone.
Yeah.
Reboarding the history train again, we kind of saw the more curvaceous body standard persist until the post-war late 40s, early 50s period of prosperity in America, where things were just going really well for us, and I mean, we were doing fine, and kind of we saw the youth movement in the beginning in the late 50s and early 60s, which idolized both kind of youth and innocence and this more free-spirited stuff, and it saw kind of also the development of the high fashion industry, which looked for kind of more boyish-looking female models and kind of more just childlike, feature. The bellwether of this was the British model Twiggy, which by nickname alone kind of tells you all you need to know about her body type. And so kind of the larger form was viewed not only as out of fashion but also kind of vulgar, kind of just like inherently suggestive by its maturity and less innocent than the other. But that was kind of a double-edged sword, because it also served as the genesis when we saw the youth movement putting forth all these political movements. It was the genesis for the creation of what at the time was called, during its founding in the late 60s, it was the National Association to Aid Fat Americans, the NAAFA. And it later changed its name, and it started with a protest for against anti-fat discrimination in New York City, and it later changed its name to the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. Which, whenever you start in America, that type of naming convention is evocative of the NAACP, which of course was an African American civil rights organization. But there was, but again, with this as a political movement, there wasn't as much necessarily of a social component to it, or an admiration component, more of an activism component. And it seems, though, that here was a instance where kind of the straight community was lagging behind the LGBTQ community, who kind of started admiration-based interest groups significantly before, starting in the early 70s. Isn't that right?
In the late 70s.
Late 70s, okay.
Well, in the late 70s, you for the first time had magazines like, for example, the Girth and Mirth magazine, which that was founded for what at that time in the gay community was Chops and Chasers. And then later on, like magazines like the Big Ed magazine, for example, where it was also more tied to fat acceptance and actually fat admiration, but they very early on realized they had this fat admiration component to them, which soon after that kind of started splitting into their own community, basically. Very similar as we had with the fat acceptance movement.
Sure, yeah, it took a couple more years, but in the early 1980s, there came to exist, as you know, as one would expect, if you like fat people and fat bodies, you're going to eventually become aware of their struggles. And so the fat acceptance movement naturally pulled along some people who were also fat admirers. And there came within the NAAFA the existence of what was later known as FA-SIG, the Fat Admiration Special Interest Group. This is probably the origin of the term FA, although I can't, you know, as an icon, although I can't be certain. And FA-SIG, as it became known, began to actually put out a newsletter, which was a printed on a daisy wheel press and stapled together out of 8x5 pieces of paper, kind of a one-man operation. And it went, you know, and this was the kind of the first newsletter for the straight fat admiration community, and it would later go on to become Dimensions magazine. And interestingly enough, I think this is true for both of us. Both of us entered the community through Dimensions magazine, so
yeah,
you know the chain of history suddenly becomes personal.
Yeah, as it always does.
Yeah, and the name change happened as a result of the NAAFA leadership and the FA-SIG leadership kind of agreeing that there was a lot of sense in making separate these two entities, because the NAAFA wanted to focus on activism, and and FA-SIG Dimensions was kind of more of a social. I mean, not that they never ever necessarily completely split each other up, but you know, there was sometimes just the work of one would not necessarily agree with the work of the other, and so they split off.
Yes, and it's interesting because I think there might have been also like the instance where people realized that this was also a sexual thing, in the sense that acceptance is one thing, but like actively seeking it out and it's kind of like the middle step in between just accepting fat people and fetism. Well, at least to me, it's kind of like a middle step. The fact to acknowledge that no, it's not just that fat people want no discrimination in their society, whether it's jobs or whether it's social beauty standards, but that fat people are also something that can be actively admired and sought out. And that is something that seems very positive when I phrase it like that, but to a lot of activists, it also took away from their cause, because they were interested in other aspects, and they thought like kind of the kinkiness, the sex-related aspects, that in many ways our culture still kind of looks down upon like the sexier and kinkier stuff as something that's like less important than like the political thing, even though they're so closely tied. It reminds me so much on some of the stuff I've been reading recently about a lot of people who've been opposed, for example, to gay pride things because of their kind of bigoted ways, who kind of are starting to accept that it's here to stay, but they still kind of make this thing about, well, gay pride, and I've even heard it like from gay people that, oh, gay pride should be like this activism thing, and we should make it political and respectable, and having like half-naked people on floats isn't the acceptable thing. And so you can still see this trend today that people kind of always want to separate those two things, even though I think they can completely coexist and they go very hand in hand. But you've also seen with the fat acceptance movement that they started to separate the admirers from the acceptance movement.
And so we've also seen that happen kind of again when the fat admiration movement, or rather than the fat admiration community, kind of was confronted with this growing like developing presence.
Took me a while to pick up on that one.
Yeah. Now this presence that not only enthusiastically proclaimed their love for the fat form and fat people, but also indicated a preference in either seeing them continue to fatten or wish to fatten themselves. The community we now know as the fetus community, the fetism community.
Yes, so we're already in the early 90s there with the Dimensions magazine, and it's interesting to us because when we looked at when like the fetism community started, and it's very hard to find something like pre-internet, we've tried to find where the term feedy and feeder may have come from. It's been a lot easier for us to find out like the gainer and encourager terms for the gay fetism community was actually coined in 1985 in February, where a group of fat admirers and gainers had a meeting in New York City where a man called John Outcalled proposed the term gainer and encourager, and they made it specifically to also differentiate gay men from their straight feeder and feedy counterparts. So we kind of assumed that feedy and feeder were already around back then in the mid-80s, but it's been almost impossible. I know you've looked into it, I've looked into it. We couldn't find like a specific moment when we first started using it. But I also think it's maybe down to the term that it's a very intuitive term, like in the first moment. Like, I like to feed someone, like whether it's spoon feeding or hand feeding, what am I going to call that person? A feeder. It's like nobody sat down and decided this is what we're going to call ourselves, basically.
Several years before then, they were on issue 4 by 1984. So my guess is that they didn't necessarily predate the 80s, but they had been active throughout. So
yeah, because I've seen, for example, like in the gay community, I found like a whole little like convention in the early 90s, even like one in the very late 80s. But also their first website, as much as I could find, was a little bit later. It was 1996, which was the Gainer Web.
No, wow. Okay, so again, I mean, this stuff is kind of around the scene at the time. They were either computer engineers or systems analysts. They were somehow tied with tech because realistically, these are the people sites back then.
Yep.
The rest of us were still stockpiling AOL CDs. But kind of what you saw in the split between the NAAFA and what would later become Dimensions, you saw kind of again with Dimensions and with the nascent fetist community. There were plenty of people in the fat admiration community who were happy to accept the idea that people found them attractive, but they found the misinformed idea, but they thought it would always be exploitative or somehow non-consensual or creepy. And there were several kind of little think pieces like that, which kind of just gave these really skewed depictions of every feeder had no other desire but to eventually fatten their feety to death, which we know is in terms of lived fetist experience, most people find an equilibrium. There are ridiculously extreme sizes. Usually you find a stopping point, and it's that's how life works. So
there's nothing wrong with having that fantasy, and I know I'm completely missing the point.
It's just not representative of the larger community. I don't think it's necessarily invalid either. People are adults. We all have our agency. You can do with it what you for whatever reason. The fetus on Dimensions were kind of corralled into this sub-board called the Weight Board, which exists to this day. It's not as frequented as it once was. But it came to pass that a lot of fetus were kind of feeling frustrated on Even Dimensions, which they thought was a place for them. They felt like they had to kind of fight to justify their position there every time they logged on. So, unsurprisingly, people started to leave or seek out alternate places. Some found Usenet groups or other bulletin boards. There was a retreat to the furry community, which had kind of its own fat fur subsection as well, intersection,
and amazing art.
And they still churn out quite a bunch of interesting art.
Yes, the art is so beautiful. I have it all over my Tumblr, and I'm sorry, I really geek out over it. Even though I'm not a furry myself, the art they produce it still gets me, because it's gangster.
Yeah, it's not too hard to see the appeal.
Yeah.
But then also some of kind of the nascent community building sites, Yahoo Groups being the biggest one. where people would create fetus-related Yahoo groups. But there was still it was very much a diaspora of the community until in the early 2000s. I believe I want to say late 2005. A site launched out of nowhere, and it was called Fantasy Feeder. And Fantasy Feeder was an interesting website for many reasons, and it was still kind of very much built in the original model of web-based feeding communities. It was the work of a small team, kind of laboring alone, and it just kind of
a few British guys, right?
Yeah, a couple British people. I know they had a few women on their mod team as well. And it just kind of appeared out of nowhere one day, and the fetus community, grasped our collective, heads and said, "Oh my goodness!" and we flocked to it en masse.
And there's again an example where we kind of were behind the gay community because, as I've mentioned, like the Gainer Web, for example, but also Belly Builders, those are explicitly gaining websites that were started in the late 90s. So. It's interesting that it took a lot longer for Fantasy Feeder to come around.
And the one of the interesting things there was the fact that it was a much more social experience than we'd seen so far. Almost all the other communities followed the model of bulletin boards, where the profile section for posters or forums. The profile section for posters was very, very small.
Gainer Web and Belly Builders at the beginning was similar until like in 2002 was the first time they started to have like a more social discussion board, which is where Fantasy Feeder also had it.
Yeah, and I mean, most people, they could only upload a profile picture. They'd have a short bio, if any. But you usually got to know people based on the content of their posting instead of their social media profile. Which in many ways kind of was on Fantasy Feeder anyway, was kind of a hybrid between a dating website type profile and an actual social media profile. And kind of also hand in glove with that idea of a dating website was the decisions of the Fantasy Feeder admin to monetize interaction. And they went through several different plans over the years on how they monetized that interaction. Sometimes they had message limits, sometimes they had picture viewing limits, sometimes they had video chat or certain types of, you could only advertise what you were looking for if you're willing to pay for it. It ended up, for the most part, and I'm speaking broadly here because Fantasy Feeder has also, they've done a relaunch of their website, and they're still around today, and people still use them. I don't personally, but there was kind of another wave of dissatisfaction with the product as it existed. And so as technology continued to march on and the ability to publish on the web kind of became more and more democratized and distributed, once again, the fetus got a little wandering eyes and looked for new stuff. And one of the biggest issues with a kind of a social media based site was its emphasis on user interaction, which certainly caused much discomfort, especially among female members of the site, because obviously there's members who just don't friggin' get it and send all sorts of like disgusting, unsolicited, unwanted emails, and just how or messages, and how frustrating it must be for someone who thought that they found the promised land where people would finally understand them for the kinksters that they were, only to be driven off by those same members that were supposedly their kindred spirits, treating them like pieces of meat.
I think it also has a lot to do with, again, how the community actually started in the first place. Even pre-internet, the predominantly, even before all those magazines were talked about, like the only way people could actually find each other were often like dating magazines where they would place ads, like kind of coded, but there were always like euphemisms on looking specifically for fat people. And the first websites we had, as we've just mentioned, were very similarly. So the idea was always, I'm going to go to the site just to find someone I can hook up or date or have a relationship with. And people weren't yet so invested in actually having like a community where more broader topics were discussed, where people could just be around and have friends who share the experiences they've had. But instead, there were a lot of people who were just actively, I'm not going to say aggressively, but who were definitely like pushing the dating aspect of it, which made a lot of people uncomfortable and still does to this day, because as we know, this kink is more than just getting off. It's about a whole other spectrum, and especially for women
Sure.
who are often outnumbered on those websites, it gets very overwhelming very fast. And I totally understand how people want to get a break from that. And
Yeah, yeah. And so we can kind of see some of the places they went to get a break. One was the microblogging site Tumblr, which has a still vibrant community of feedists interacting and posting material and reblogging things,
and a bunch of female feeders.
and a bunch of female feeders as well through feedism hashtags. Really, it doesn't really have a group system or anything that works similarly. And one of the advantages was that Tumblr's messaging was notoriously broken for
Yes.
years and just didn't. I mean, I think they fixed it recently, but it just wasn't the type of system that fomented as much direct social interaction, which is how some people prefer to interact with the community, kind of as creator and audience versus just people in a conversation. And that's that's completely valid too.
What people first thought was a big flaw of it was actually a huge advantage to some point. And that was very similar to DeviantArt, that also, while having a messaging system, it's a very, very limited one, to say the least. And people choose to, for those who aren't familiar, DeviantArt is a website to share art. And there's a lot of kink art on there because they don't have like nudity guidelines. That's another example where there are a lot of female participants that like kind of choose to avoid the more like messaging based websites that we have today.
Yeah, and the the other one that I wanted to mention was YouTube itself, which was kind of for me it was a sleeper. I never even thought of YouTube as like a social site or a community site. I thought it was basically just
like makeup advice, do it yourself advice.
No, you watch people play video games. No, I have I use mainly funny cat videos, but I thought people would just post things and then, they'd kind of be out there. And instead, people are making videos which reply to each other and respond to each other and react to each other. And some of those people are interested in bellies just as much as we are. And, with the advent of universal high-speed internet and, decent webcams or decent cameras on people's phones and standardized webcams, vlogging or the production of weekend blog, and who doesn't love a good progression video or a belly play video or
exactly.
any of that stuff's gold.
Yeah.
And here you had it built on Google technology where it's a stable platform and it's free and everything's fun. And so the whole thing was it makes sense in retrospect. I was just surprised to have kind of seen it come out of nowhere.
Yeah, YouTube also launched in 2005, so it was around the same time. It's like shortly before Fantasy Feeder actually started.
Mm-hmm. And then, so kind of as those communities begin to pick up steam, and some of the participation on Fantasy Feeder cooled a little bit, then the as you've mentioned, the gay community once again way ahead of the curve, 4 or 5 years previous. Grokio, the guys behind Phoebe, had launched Grommer, which is essentially which is the model. Phoebe is a reskinned Grommer, not vice versa.
Yeah, so Grommer started almost 5 years ago now. I think they had their 5th anniversary just a few months ago. They basically came up with the idea of having this like specifically gaining, and also they also included the Chapman Tracer community, and they started Grommer, which was amazing because for the first time you had those very, very thorough profiles that were not only thorough, but they can also just have those tags, and people were it was very easy for people to find each other. It had a news feed, which hadn't been seen before, but which obviously from our experiences from Facebook and Twitter were very sought after. People really enjoy communicating through the news feed while still having their own profiles and having a way to contact each other. Which also kind of brings me to mention the female feeder, like the whole female feederesses and straight gainers or bi gainers, for example, because what we'd seen in like Back to Dimensions and even Fantasy Feeder, there was this predominantly BBW and male-fed admirer or even male feeder oriented focus that just kind of left out all the female feeders and the guys who were exclusively into gaining and were not interested in like mutual gaining relationships. It was perfectly fine for us to set up profiles, obviously, on sites like Fantasy Feeder, but it was really hard to find each other. And Grommer, for example, a lot of straight guys or BBWs had no idea that Grommer was around, obviously, because it was specifically targeted to a gay male audience.
But they launched Phoebe for the straight gainer encourager feeder community, and it landed like a bombshell.
Definitely,
We all lost our minds collectively and rushed to it. And there were a few months when we got started where it was nearly exclusively fetus and solely marketed towards fetus. Here was a place we could call our own. But, some of the same problems kind of follow us from community to community. And since then, Phoebe, although it's been incredibly fun, it has an enormous, I think, 85,000 as of today's user base, about half of whom are regularly active. So that's still a ton of people.
Yeah.
And, and with them have come some people who are not necessarily into feedism. There are some people who are, who troll the community, who, and these things are not, not unique to Phoebe. They're
they've been
not,
around in every website we had.
Yeah, and every website everyone's had. We could have a website about repairing Model T Fords, and we'd still get some sort of jackass, I'm sure. But one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the increasing democratization of the ability to have a voice on the web. And so we've seen people who've been frustrated for one reason or another by how Phoebe or Tumblr, one of the other websites, goes about things. And they've responded by doing their own thing, which is actually a really neat aspect of the community. Two sites kind of spring to mind. One is FF Ambrosia or Fam Ambrosia, or however anyone says it these days. But that was made by a female feeder, Belly Admirer, and she went so far as to kind of create her, to address the problem you brought up once and for all by creating her own website, which serves as a community primarily focused at openly acknowledging the focus on female feeders and male gainers and male feedees. And that's been, it's been a remarkable website for several reasons. One, in that it's the first of these websites that's been completely run by women.
I'm on the mod team,
and you're on the mod team. Full disclosure, and one of the interesting things is there's kind of all these issues of member on member harassment or just stalking. It gets just a whole bunch of things that kind of make the other community is a little bit of a pain in the ass to deal with when it, when bad actors get in there, and it just really hasn't happened in FF Ambrosia.
No, we get very little of them.
It's been focused on the content. Now, it doesn't have the same size user base, but it's a significant user base. Significantly north of thousands of users. And for whatever reason, it just really doesn't seem to happen as much. So who knows? Maybe that was the fix. We just needed women running the show. And then again, we have another one that it launched and then had to close down for retooling, but it will launch again, and that's Feedist.net, whose name pays tribute to an earlier website, which I want to take a moment to talk about, which is Feedism.net, which was only up for a few months a couple of years ago. But it introduced three things that I thought all three of them were really neat. One was the existence of verified profiles. Kind of again, as the community gets to a certain size, we start getting people who are catfishing or trolling or playing games, and verified profiles allowed users to message mods with, photos of themselves holding up like a picture of their URL or some sort of code, and then the mods would just add a verified tag to their profile. FF Ambrosia has a similar system.
Exactly, which is also optional, but it's a very nice feature.
Sure, and I just know, I'm certainly more comfortable interacting with verified members for obvious reasons. The second was that Feedism.net was couples profiles. It follows that in a community like this where people meet each other and start dating and form relationships, they might want to preserve relationships within the community without, necessarily maintaining a profile that they'd used for dating previously. And so the introduction of couples profiles was cool because it acknowledged that we could continue, that the community was more than just a meat market. We could continue to persist in these friendships and relationships, that we've had. And some of my friends in the community I've known for more than a decade at this point, which is bizarre to say because I've never meet them face to face. But we don't necessarily check in every day, but I'm graduated from college corresponding with some of them, and I went back to law school and I graduated from, and I spent all my 20s and grew up with these people, and it's been fun, and it's more than just
Yeah, and it's definitely a point where we don't give the discussion boards enough credit to some extent, because
sure,
that's where for the first time they oftentimes, even Fantasy Feeder, didn't just have the feedism related stuff, they also had the whole other like miscellaneous topics and the hobbies and stuff like that. And on FF Ambrosia you can see we have groups where people can bond over certain topics and just talk about those topics, and where we really are moving towards more of a community.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think that's unquestionably a great sign. We have to like it,
Yeah, definitely.
And so they also gave us the name feedism, which it's not a perfect term, but I think it's way better than feederism, which not only does it have all the negative history associated with people's perceptions of the community, it also kind of places too much emphasis on the feeder as the active party in the relationship. So it was interesting for certain, but it vanished. And Fetus.net, I think, is trying to harken back to some of that and create a fetus forward, fetus focused community. And good luck to them if they can. It's exciting to be a part of the greater community now, because who knows what the next year will bring. We saw so much happen in the last 12 months. In fact, this very podcast didn't exist a year ago, and now
it didn't exist 4 months ago.
Yeah.
So,
with all this entire history has just been
listening in your car or on your iPhone or on your Android. I'm really sorry I haven't put this podcast up on Google Play, but I'm gonna do it. But yeah, I've listened to the Gain Tirade back when it was on, which was led by two gainers and encouragers from Grammar. And to anyone listening, I highly recommend the amazing podcast, The Gaining Life, which has one guest each episode where they go through basically their origin stories and their approach to the kink. And it's a still running podcast. It's amazing, and you can find it on Tumblr. But yeah, so we might be the first official. It's good or bad, but we're here.
Well, I mean, let's go with good. I think it's good.
Yeah. I think we're gonna keep mentioning it, because even though we've seen all those splits within the community, just looking back at the history, you can see that we kind of all came from the same place at some point or another. And even though we had our issues with how the Fed admiration community treated the feeders, or how the Fed acceptance people treated the Fed admirers, or even how the bear community treats the Chops and Chasers, and the Chops and Chasers treat the way more in common than we have things that actually divide us. And that's definitely something I kind of like about this podcast, that we're kind of trying to combine a little bit of everything, even though we're both feedists, but we're also Fed admirers, and of course we're Fed acceptance.
That's a great way to responsibly interact with the community. It's not for everyone, but the community. I always like saying that the winds of apathy do their work. It'll eventually wither and die, but luckily there's enough people who seem to really care about the future of the community more than just what they can get out of it. That makes me feel very, very positive indeed about the future of the online feedism community. So I am both a product of the history of the community, and also hopefully in some small way a tiny link in the chain moving towards whatever comes next. And I'm excited to see. But I think that's all I had about the general history of the community. Did you have anything else before we wrap up, TLC?
No. That was a great way to tie everything together. I think it's just fascinating. I had such a good time researching all this kind of stuff. I want to just say to everyone, if you just look this stuff up, we're going to have show notes at the end
Yeah,
where
sure.
we're going to kind of share some links with you where you can read into the pictures of the Fat Men's Clubs, for example. I have the Boston Globe article where they had actual pictures of their meetings and things like that. And we're going to have some links on the Fat Acceptance Movement and where that came from. And history is so interesting. And as you've seen, like, it gets personal sooner or later because we're just part of it. And just everyone, go look this up. It's so interesting. Whether you're an art nerd and you want to look into the Baroque art movement that they had and everything, it's amazing. I'm such a nerd.
Well, you're the right type of nerd.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're really scratching the surface. We could do a whole season of podcasts on nothing but the history of the community, and I certainly went into it with some expectations of what I found and was surprised, and in almost entirely pleasant ways. It was really enjoyable to kind of feel more connected to the greater history of the community. So be sure to check out the show notes.
But before we actually get to the end of the podcast, we have another amazing palate cleanser for you. So Pizza Wolf, take it away.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, well, it's hard to follow that really kind of long-reaching podcast, but I'll do my best. The palate cleanser I have for this week is my top 3 unsolicited messages on Phoebe. Yeah, I know. We talked about it a little bit, being kind of things within the community that caused people to go away, and as a man on the websites, my unsolicited messages are probably way tamer than what the average woman gets, but I can relate to y'all at least a little bit. So I wanted to give you my top 3 unsolicited messages. Just as a note, I have a caveat on my profile that says, if you message me, just bring up Bart Simpson.
Hey,
it's an easy.
Don't tell people,
Yeah.
otherwise they won't have an incentive to read your profile now.
Well, if they listen to the podcast, I mean, we're in. It's way easier to read my
Good
profile
enough.
than to listen to a 90-minute podcast.
True.
Yeah, but no, if it's just an easy way to make sure someone's read my profile, and if I get an unsolicited message that doesn't mention Bart Simpson, I can usually predict pretty easily where it's going to go. So number 3 I received just earlier in June, and it started with, "You really hate people, huh? Lol." And I think I just said something on a comment, and this guy thought that was the way to get me to go for him, and it didn't work out well for him. All these profiles ended with me getting blocked. Usually I just ignore, but sometimes I troll hard if I want to. So the next one I had, the subject was "Huge bellies are hot," and which hey, I agree. But the body of the message is all a lowercase single sentence lacking any punctuation whatsoever.
Okay.
In its entirety, it reads, "So, question for you, how big are wanted to get your belly? I love massive bellies. My ex was well over 600 till he died in a car crash 4 years ago, so I am looking for my Prince Charming maniac." And, they said, "Wow, I thought I was having a conversation. Never mind." That type of obvious copy-paste stuff. I know guys out there, you hear occasionally from women saying, give me more than just a one-word message. Or anything, but that's not better.
Yeah.
And that actually brings me to my number 1 unsolicited message, which is, of course, is just "Hey." I don't know why people do it. It's just such a low percentage shot. It's even better when it comes from someone who has no profile picture and no profile information up. And just even a handle that's just something that's that completely random numbers and letters. It's like, if you think anyone's going to respond to you on that,
it's a numbers game. It's a numbers game they're playing, but
that's what it has to be.
I could make a whole podcast episode on why you shouldn't just write "Hey," and I know many people still don't get it, and they're well intentioned, but it's just I'm gonna ignore all the reasons why hey is just the stupidest way to approach someone. Even when you're on the street, you don't just go walk up to someone and say hey and then you shut up and look at them.
Yeah.
Like, it's weird. Sorry, you can't just say like, I was just gonna have this normal conversation. But even just consider that you're maybe 1 out of 50 guys that day who message the same girl hey. Yeah, you're not gonna stand out, so why not just make it a little bit personal and up your chances, and you're already taking over like 50 other guys that are competing with you.
There you go. Sure, yeah. Well, on that note, I will let you know that I don't mind an unsolicited message as long as you read the profile and have something of value to say. Feel free to talk to me. I'm friendly. I always like to talk kind of chubby shop with people. And if you want to reach out to me, you can do so on either Phoebe or FF Ambrosia. I'm Pizza Wolf on both of those.
And you can find me as Tender Loving Cares as well. I'm on Phoebe, on FF Ambrosia, also on Tumblr. I'm tenderlovingcares.tumblr.com. For our grammar listeners, I have a Hungry profile, which is just Hungry, that you can find where you can send any feedback. You can message me if you want to. I have this very podcast is also embedded on my website. If for some reason you don't like SoundCloud or iTunes or all the other websites we're on, including YouTube, you can find this episode and a lot of other information on the Hungry magazine, which is a BHM FFA-focused magazine that I run, and that's on my website, which is hungrymagazine.com. But if you want to support just my part of the Feedism community, like if you want to support my magazine, for example, I have a Patreon. We don't yet have a Patreon for the podcast, but you can support the magazine, which comes out between 2 and 4 times a year. It's patreon.com/hungry. And shout out to the amazing artist who made her intro music, which is One Deadly Sin. So if you want to check out his gaming Tumblr, it's gamingstraight.tumblr.com. And if you want to hear more from him, also check out his SoundCloud, which is soundcloud.com/MikeAshley. All those links, all that info, our contact info, and also the link for our show notes will be on the description, whether you're listening on YouTube or you're listening on iTunes. I'm going to put all of it in the description. You can just click on it. Click some of the amazing articles and links and just keep researching from there because it's going to be fascinating. I guarantee it.
Yeah, it certainly will be. And so with that, until next time, I'm Pizza Wolf.
And I'm Tender Loving Cares.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
I'm hungry. I'm so hungry. Yeah. I'm hungry. I'm so hungry.